Hi, Alana. So great to see you again. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Marcos.
I think the last time that we spoke, you spoke on a Be Social Change panel, and we were actually in New York a year ago. So pre-pandemic, pre all of this, and we'll definitely get into how this is impacting your work and kind of the industry as a whole. But I'd love for you to just get started and tell us a little bit about yourself and the work you currently do.
Yeah, so thank you for having me again. And my name is Alana Cheeks-Lomax. I currently am a senior manager on working at Microsoft. So I sit on our global diversity and inclusion team, and I'm responsible for managing Microsoft strategy around representation data and how we use insights and think about data to inform the global strategy.
Awesome. And I think I'd love for you to just share, like, how do you define diversity and inclusion? I know this has been something that people have been talking about more and more in 2020 and just over the past recent years, but maybe not everybody has a full understanding of what that encompasses. So we'd love for you to share a little bit more about that.
Yeah, and I think at the most fundamental level, diversity is kind of the what and the inclusion is that how piece. And when we talk about the what, it's the people that come to the workforce or in your organization and everything from race and gender to ethnicity to those with disabilities, veterans, religious differences, whatever that looks like. And then inclusion is how we're all, how companies are working to make sure that everyone feels involved and included as part of the large organization. But I think your question around what is diversity and inclusion, I think that is evolving. I think as we think about what's happening in the world today between COVID, what's happening with racial justice, companies are taking a very different look and lens at how we define that and what it means to a business, right? And is it just something that's in HR, or is it something we think about for our customers and our products, or whatever that might be? But I feel like the definition is evolving in the sense that it's requiring more, and it's requiring more for businesses to look at it holistically, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's happened in 2020 with a number of things that have happened, like you mentioned, COVID and all the racial justice situations that have been emerging globally, how has kind of anti-racist principles and this concept of an anti-racist organization been integrated into what we mean by diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, really good question. And the way that I think of an anti-racist organization is it's an organization that recognizes that systemic racism is real and that there are probably aspects of systemic racism that exist within your workplace, and you are actively, as a company, working to dismantle those systems that lead to racism, right? And the things that I think about are, the challenges that companies have around bias in hiring and who gets promoted, right? We know pay equity is still a challenge in many industries, and when you break down the numbers between men and women and you break it down by ethnicity and background, those gaps get bigger. We're still seeing challenges in C-suite where there's not a lot of people represented that look like, what the world looks like really, and it's not reflected in that. So to me, those are the systems that are still existing, and companies need to be working to dismantle systems because racism has influenced those systems and influenced how we think about workplaces and how we think about culture there.
Yeah, and I think one question that you're making me think about is that, like you mentioned, D&I has been around for a while and it's continually evolving. And where did you, maybe before 2020, did this anti-racist policies and concepts fit within an organization and its programs or strategies? And how has that changed now because of what's recently happened?
Yeah, to be honest, I don't think it was there. I think that for the longest time, if I think about diversity and inclusion of the 90s and early 2000s, it was really kind of programming focused on career development, right? It was really sitting in the HR space, and it was okay, we need to get people, we want to get more people to C-suite, and women, we want to get more women to C-suite, or whatever that looked like. I don't think we were thinking about it in terms of anti-racism, because I don't think people recognize the brevity of when we talk about diversity and inclusion and what that means for the world. And I think 2020 has made people realize, what we're seeing happen in the racial justice movement, what we're seeing happen with COVID and people's access to internet and education and food and jobs and housing has made people realize these are broader conversations. And again, they're systems. So now companies are well, not everyone, but I think I see a lot of companies we need to figure out how to hit all these things. And it just can't be someone sitting in HR that puts together a mentorship program and is hoping that that's going to change diversity and inclusion for a company, because it's not, right?
Yeah, and you're kind of making me think about it at all these different layers or levels where you think about an organization, and at the end of the day, it's people, right? Two people can make an organization and as you grow. But then the organization or the company is also within a particular context, which is the economic system. And how are you seeing, and then there's all the companies that play with that, including nonprofits and kind of the public sector as well. And how do you see this interesting balance of whether you want to use the word capitalism, mixed economy, whatever that is, of kind of systemic challenges when it comes to race within the economy as a whole? Like, how do you feel organizations, what role do they play both within their organization and kind of like externally in the system they're operating in?
Yeah, and it's where I feel like I don't want to go down a rabbit hole here, but I do think that, like, when it comes to economy, so when I think about, like, even if you think about like anti-racism in an economy, the one thing that comes to me for me right off the bat is equity, right? Like level playing fields for people to be able to exist and coexist economically and have the same advantages as others. I think what companies are recognizing, particularly companies, I think there's a couple of things I want to say here. I think what a lot of companies have realized in 2020, and I think this was a little bit before 2020, is when you think about economies, the people that are playing in those economies are also participating in those economies. They're customers, but their customers have a lot of say in how they need to be shaping these conversations and what they're thinking about. And there's plenty of examples in the D&I lens where a company did something poorly and it reverberated through their customer base. And the next thing you know, it's on Twitter and it's on the news and everyone's like, well, we're canceling so-and-so because they did something really silly and didn't think about diversity and inclusion when they did that. And I think the one example that comes to mind is, you probably remember this, Marcos, the Pepsi commercial when it was like, oh yeah, Black Lives Matter. Like it was one of those things that I remember when I first saw it, I was like, did no one catch it? Like, did no one think this might cause an issue? But that hurt them really badly. And unfortunately for companies, when they get hurt that badly in the public eye, what happens next? Stocks get affected, like there's bad press, like there's all these reverberating effects. So I think there's layers and overlapping concepts when we talk about anti-racism in the workplace, how that affects economies, customer bases, and that full circle moment of what companies need to be thinking about. But I think there are lots of conversations to be had about how we think about economies because, it's important. And I don't know if, hopefully I'm articulating okay. But
I think there's a couple things that are kind of popping up. First of all, I think the example with the Pepsi, I'm glad you brought that up, the Pepsi ad, is that it gives an example of just not only a company as a whole, but all the layers and all the people that saw that were unconscious or to a certain extent kind of just did not pay attention to what this actually meant. And as a side note, there's an amazing, if you've seen it, the Saturday Night Live skit that compliment that is about that, and it clearly indicates like everybody should have known that this shouldn't have been out in public. I think the second is that I think it's one thing for companies to look internally, but I think they have, and I don't want to say an obligation or responsibility, but more, you can even say it like they have also a business imperative to be able to ensure that there is equity in the economy because it serves them and it also serves their customers as well.
Absolutely. And a lot of companies, I'm trying to think of examples where I've seen it done really well. When you think about business models and you're focused on that customer base and how you're serving the economy in that way, it reflects, it does come back, right? And I don't want to get into like microeconomics right now, but it's an important aspect of this conversation. And I think this goes back to this, where the definition and the rule book around this work and this industry is like changing in a way that we haven't seen it change in a long time because people are recognizing what it means across the life cycle of a business.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also just thinking about businesses in kind of the larger context are being forced, whether they like it or not, to take a stand. And then I think what ends up happening, both from a consumer standpoint and then just also organizations, companies in their industry. But I think when they take the stand, and I'd love to get your thoughts, is that they take a public stand, but their history is still there. So it makes clear, is this something that's PR or is it something that they are actually part of their core values?
Yeah, and it can easily be seen as a PR play. And I think I can always think of the companies that didn't do it right. So another company I'm thinking of, and you probably remember this in the summertime when everyone was posting black squares on Instagram as a way to support the movement. There were companies who blatantly did not respect this conversation and were doing this. And one of those companies was the San Francisco 49ers. And everyone's like, wait a second, you had Colin Kaepernick on your team who was talking about this and you guys ignored him. And now, he's not playing in the NFL. But to me, that's an example of like being thoughtful about it because people recognize that and they say, you're just doing this because that's what everyone else is doing. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And what are the types of based on what's happening, what we're talking about and what's happened this year, what are some of the programs or strategies or initiatives that you've seen, whether it's at Microsoft or whether it's at other organizations that you feel have been effective in integrating an anti-racist policy or practices? I guess what are some good examples?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interventions that companies can be thinking about. And I think it depends on where a company's at on their maturity model per se and kind of how they're managing this work. A couple of things that come to mind to me, obviously, are trainings. That's a big thing that companies are going through. And, allyship is a word that we tend to throw out a lot in this industry. And I've seen a lot of companies really focus on how to train people on being allies and what does allyship mean in the workplace and how does that affect, your everyday life as an employee of a company. One of the other things I think is really important is leadership, like in leadership training. And I think it's one thing to be talking to, maybe an entry-level person or a mid-level manager. Because the other thing about this conversation is now workplaces are multi-generational in ways they haven't been. So everyone has very different perspectives. But I've seen a lot of companies focus on leadership and leadership training to get leaders to really understand the imperative of these problems and why this is important. Because at the end of the day, many of them are the ones making these decisions. And then, of course, everything from talent strategies of how you're developing talent to how you're recruiting talent. But I think the inclusion piece, too, of also just how you're keeping people in your company is a really big focal point. Because I always say people have options and they can go to other companies.
Yeah. And the leadership piece is interesting to think about. Well, everything that you kind of layered kind of falls into this idea, this funnel that it's both kind of this moral and kind of social justice imperative and also business imperative that when you have diverse groups of people and ideas at the table, outcomes are better. And it's recognizing that there's those motivational factors in order to integrate these.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. Data shows that too. Absolutely.
Yeah. So what's interesting, so as this is evolving and as there's more integration of anti-racist strategies or practices and programs, what are some of or are there some traditional D&I initiatives or programs or even frameworks that have fallen by the wayside or kind of been outdated because of what's been evolving?
I think, I don't know if I would say outdated. I think they've had to be revamped because I do think there's still a lot to be said about professional development programs and mentoring programs and kind of having a really strong workforce strategy and kind of, thinking about pipeline and recruiting. Some of the things I've seen that they're kind of like flagship programs, but people are changing the lens. So like COVID we're all remote, right? So now it's even harder to maintain culture because I can't just go into your office or say hello to you in the hallway and we go to grab lunch one day. We're all now in computers and it's like, how do you maintain that and still keep me excited about work? But I also think that presents opportunities, right? Companies now have an opportunity to also build a workforce that might be different. And especially in my industry, the tech industry, there's not a lot of cities or there's certain hubs, right, for tech. So you come to the West Coast or maybe you're in New York or down in Austin. But now there's opportunities for companies to maybe hire someone that lives in Arkansas or hire someone in Louisiana or Chicago that might not have moved to a Seattle or San Francisco, but they can still add to the culture and they can still be a part of this company that maybe those opportunities didn't present themselves before. So I feel like I think some of the flagship programs still do work. It's just kind of putting a different lens on them. And I think COVID's forced us to put new lenses. And as we get out of COVID, it will continue to force us to do something new as well.
Yeah, one thing that you're just making me see that I hadn't really thought about is based on, because we're all in front of computer screens, is that part of a deeper understanding of the fact that there is racism in all these contexts that we're dealing with is having conversations with people, and some of those people that have faced that. And some of that is like bumping into shoulders kind of at work or water cooler. It's harder to create that virtual water cooler. Yeah. So are there things that you all have done or you've seen other companies do to try to help facilitate those connections or conversations aside from just like kind of Zoom meetings?
Yeah, so our team, and it's hard. So the things that we've kind of done at Microsoft, and I've seen other companies do, they're trying to recreate like virtual happy hours. So they might be sending like cocktail kits to everybody at home, and everyone's kind of on the line and they're, doing something. I've seen teams do like scavenger hunts within like a city, like within their local city. Of course, not the teams doing it together, but everyone has a different clue as part of the scavenger hunt, and they try to work together to kind of bring that together. I think that I've also just seen companies really be thoughtful about like how people are managing time, which I think is also part of the work-life balance and the inclusion part, because I don't know about you, but sometimes I'm like, my commute is my bedroom to my living room. So it's like 5 minutes. And I can be on the computer all day for like 12 hours. And you're like, this is way more work than I've ever done when I'm in the office, right? So I think there's some things I've seen do well, but I also think it's hard. And even at Microsoft, like we are already a global company, but it's fatigue being on video all the time. And quite frankly too, like not everyone wants to be on video all the time, and not everyone wants to show their home or like show where they're at. So it can be really hard to manage that.
Yeah, and part of that is the connection with other people, and then I think the other side of it, as you mentioned, like trainings, which is harder to do. Yeah, you can do training on a virtual setting. Have there been other things that people have been implementing in terms of kind of delivering some of that content and that information that people need to honestly digest in order to learn? Like I could see there's obviously kind of these video conferences. Has anybody tried podcasts or webinar? What's been that you feel what are things that have been effective?
Yeah, I haven't seen podcasts yet, but that's actually a really good idea, podcasts. I've seen webinars, like we do virtual training, so we will record people as if they're in a classroom setting, and then there will be someone at the front of the classroom who's literally teaching as if you were like all in person, and that has seemed to work for us, and I'm sure other companies are doing that. But I think it's really trying to recreate the in-person experience, which is hard to do. Like it's not easy, but I think people in every industry are getting creative. Like I read an article, in the New York Times a couple weeks ago about a judge who was trying to have court outside in a park. And I mean, that's hard. I know that's hard to do, but it was like, this is my way of recreating the courtroom, because we all can't be sitting inside. But like that was their innovative way of trying to like do something different to bring people together and bring, kind of have people in person.
Yeah. And I think what's gonna, just like with any kind of crisis or situation like this, I think it forces innovation. And I think people are going to be trying lots of different things in companies. And as we go back into in-person, hopefully we learn these best practices that can layer in this in-person and online kind of symbiotic relationship of making things much more effective.
Yeah, for sure. And I think companies have had to learn quickly, right? Like the pivot has been quick. And I don't know if we're going to go back to a place where everyone's in the office Monday through Friday all at the same time. Like I think it's going to look different, but we'll see what it looks like for every company.
And what are you seeing? I think as we're thinking about a little bit of the future, are there things that you're seeing? Like, I guess, how do you see this work in terms of D&I in the next kind of I guess I would say maybe 1 or 2 years evolving as we move out of 2020?
Yeah, I think so I think two things selfishly, because this is my work. One of the things I see that's happening a lot in this space is that people are really being more data led around how they think about inclusion or diversity and inclusion, and how they implement strategies, initiatives, et cetera, because, obviously every company has different access to data, and some are more robust in their ability to compute and analyze and all that stuff. But being able to understand what's happening within your organization from the sense of the numbers and looking at data tells you a lot about what you can be doing around this work. So whether it's an employee survey, whether it's, we talked about pay gaps before, if you see that that's something in your organization, like how do you plug those holes, and how do you think about that as part of the inclusion strategy? And the beauty of this work is that you can go in so many different directions depending on what your company needs. But I see more and more people talk about using analytics and predictive analytics and data to really shape these conversations, which I think is really cool.
And is that something that's been new, a little bit new, kind of within the context of D&I?
I think so. Yeah. I think in the past few years, I've seen it. I've seen the evolution of it. And I think before, because the D&I that we were seeing earlier was really just kind of sitting in one part of an organization. It is usually just strictly programming. And that's an important part of the work, but it was sitting in HR, and that was kind of it. And there wasn't any kind of integration points outside of that, but I see it evolving quickly to be more than just that.
Yeah, yeah. And can you share a little bit, you hinted on it, and can you share a little bit about the specific work you do and what your day-to-day looks like? I know that's changed recently, but could you share a little bit more about your specific work?
Yeah, so like my work kind of fits into 3 buckets at Microsoft around data. So it's not only helping design the data strategy, it's also helping our senior leadership team understand kind of the insights that we're seeing from the data at like a 30,000 foot Microsoft view, right? So what does it look like across each of our demographics? How are we managing people leaving, people coming? You know, what does our employee sentiment look like around inclusion and belonging and all those topics? So there's a lot of work that I do with that team to help them understand, you know, what the data is telling us. Then there's also a portion of my work that's focused internally on my team around programming. So when we put out trainings for all of Microsoft, you know, we do a lot of work around allyship and covering. We started doing more work around privilege, like how are people interacting with the trainings? How many people are taking them? Kind of what is the feedback we're getting, and can we use that to improve or, you know, introduce more topics into the system? And then the other big piece is I work a lot with our people analytics team, again, to do large scale analysis around what our data is telling us. So it can be anything from how are people, like what's the pipeline when people apply for a job and then they get a job, kind of like, are there areas that we're seeing some challenges? Is the data telling us, hey, we need to plug a hole here? So it could be a number of different things. And I love it because there's a lot of autonomy around, hey, we can do so much. And of course, taking the direction from the chief diversity officer is what drives a lot of the work.
Yeah. And then do you try to then take that data and then map it out in terms of, I don't know if it's productivity, in terms of ROI, like what does that look like in terms of then how do we use that information to make data-driven decisions of Microsoft as a whole moving forward?
Yeah, so our people analytics team there's about like 70 people, so it's a pretty big group, and there are different people who are responsible for different analyses and kind of own certain parts of the data. So when we do like an all-up analysis and we find something interesting, then we'll share that with like the businesses and the leaders, and we'll let them know what we find, and then from there will be conversations about, you know, what do we tactically need to do to address this, or what are the programs you want to implement, or even pilots that we want to manage to kind of change how we're thinking about this. So it's cool to be able to see the data and then use it to make decisions and figure out how to embed that in this large ecosystem that is Microsoft.
Yeah. And one question, I actually asked that after that. I think the next question is, how did you arrive at the kind of work that you do right now? Like, what's been your career trajectory, and what's been the experience and the training and the skills that you need to develop to get into this type of work?
Yeah, it's funny you used to ask that, Marcos, because my career path into D&I has not been straight at all. Like it's been a little jagged. So I started I went to grad school for healthcare policy. And when I came out of grad school, I was doing work at Deloitte Consulting and was working with healthcare clients and doing a lot of strategy work, business transformation work. And when I started working with healthcare clients, I started doing work in the health equity space. So really like basically diversity and inclusion, but healthcare. So working with providers and hospital systems to help them understand and manage care for certain communities and what that looked like, and started training physicians around unconscious bias and inclusion in the medical field. And that for me was a natural transition to start wanting to do more of this work, and started doing work internally with Deloitte, and then decided I wanted to kind of make this into a career, and then ended up pivoting into tech and at Microsoft, where, I'm doing this full time now.
And are there, if there's people that are wanting to get into this field, like what are the things that you have seen or recommend in terms of skills or training? And I know D&I has a lot of different aspects to it, but what are some tips on that?
I think one of the biggest things is passion, right? Like this work is really hard. There are days when I'm just like, why can't we just take a magic bullet and fix everything? But we can't. So definitely having passion about this. I always tell people just to read and understand and learn, like the nomenclature, the concepts, things are constantly changing in the D&I world, and what you have to be thinking about is important. So I listen to a lot of like podcasts, and I read a lot of books, and I always recommend that people do that. And I also think just if you're interested in getting into this work, trying to work internally in your companies first, or taking on, opportunities that maybe allow you to do D&I work with a civic organization, or kind of volunteering, because even my experience, it started off just as like, this is my passion. And I started doing some side work in it to learn more and understand more. But I will say the good thing about this space is that people come from all different backgrounds doing this type of work, and you can be successful with a number of different backgrounds.
Yeah. And we've been talking a lot at kind of the organizational level. And when you're implementing these types of programs or strategies, or even having these conversations as an individual within an organization, how do you prep people for these types of conversations, I think in general, and the differences between someone who's a person of color or not?
Yeah. When you're thinking about it like at the ground level and having these conversations, the biggest thing I've seen is making sure the right people are at the table, one, right? So, in the larger companies, that's a little harder to do than smaller companies. But I find that what I've seen is that not all the right people are at the table, and that can be challenging as you're having these conversations. But two, I would say like the biggest thing is just like the openness to have the conversations, and wanting to bring stakeholders and the right allies to the table. And I feel like I'm losing my words here. I'm sorry, Marcos. Well, your first part of the question was just like, who do you bring to the table?
Yeah, like I guess in terms of like how do you end up kind of prepping those people in order to have those conversations? And I think you mentioned you need to have those right people at the table to possibly like think about maybe set the context and the tone.
Yeah, having those right people at the table. And I think, at the end of the day, these are not easy conversations to have, right? Like it's not like you're looking at like a spreadsheet and saying, this is our sales, or like, hey guys, this is like, I don't know, some other related topic. Like these are really hard, real and fast conversations. And I find that it can be challenging for folks who are not part of these communities that, we are talking about, to be at the table. But I also find that many people want to be at the table, and they want to learn and they want to understand. So it's really embracing that, and being able to talk thoughtfully with these individuals about, whatever your subject is.
Yeah, and I think because when you just mentioned the spreadsheet, that's like really important to think about, because this is not to a large extent an analytics kind of situation. You can get analytics from it, but you're dealing with people, and that in and of itself is always going to be messy, because you're dealing with like emotions, but you're also dealing with people's different kind of stages of development, all different levels, openness, kind of education level in terms of this. So it's a much more challenging and dance that you have to go through in order to do this type of work.
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of it is meeting people where they're at. Everyone is not, everyone's on a different journey, and some people are more mature in their journey than others. And some people also want to be more mature in their journey, but they don't know how to do that. So it can be meeting folks where they're at a lot of the times.
So if there's kind of in wrapping up the conversation, if there's kind of one takeaway from our conversation that you'd like to share with the audience to kind of help them create a more inclusive and equitable organization, are there one or two things that you would share?
What are the one or two things?
Or things that they could think about or implement or try to do within their organizations?
So I think it's important to start the conversations. And I say that to say there probably are not many companies who are shying away from this right now in this present moment in time, because people are being very thoughtful about it in a way that they probably might not have been before, but also recognizing it's something that's really, really needed. I think being able to be courageous and brave to start the conversations, and also being vocal about what you think your organization might need. And I think sometimes, I say this all the time, where I think a lot of companies just don't know what they don't know. And sometimes it's the workforce that can help them figure out, hey, as an employee here, these are the things I know are important to me, or I've brought a group together and we've talked about, this being important to us. Because I think leaders appreciate that, because a lot of people are just trying to find themselves in these conversations right now and don't really know where to start. And I think your workforce can be an important part of that, or the workforce, I should say, the important part of that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Great way to end the conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise. And I know that the people listening will gain a lot from it and being able to implement these things in helping their organizations become much more equitable and integrate these anti-racist practices.
Awesome. Thank you, Marcos. I appreciate the time.
Thank you.